I believe that all people are in possession of what might be called a universal musical mind. Any true music speaks with this universal mind to the universal mind in all people. The understanding that results will vary only insofar as people have or have not been conditioned to the various styles of music in which the universal mind speaks. Consequently, often some effort and exposure is necessary in order to understand some of the music coming from a different period or a different culture than that to which the listener has been conditioned. I do not agree that the layman's opinion is less of a valid judgment of music than that of the professional musician. In fact, I would often rely more on the judgment of a sensitive layman than that of a professional, since the professional, because of his constant involvement with the mechanics of music, must fight to preserve the naivety that the layman already possesses.
Say on television. Hello there. My name is Steve Allen, and I'm here to tell you about another piano player. Merely as a music lover, as a listener, I enjoy the piano of Bill Evans. But in my capacity as pianist and composer too, I'm enormously impressed by the scope of his achievement. He's much more, you see, than just another good jazz pianist, although he's certainly that. But in addition, as I say, he is a force, an influence. There are certain jazz pianists, I guess Earl Garner would probably be the best example to make my point, who are an art form unto themselves. Garner is brilliant, you know that. But if you deliberately copy his style, for example... It always comes out sounding a little like a put-on, you know, like when actors or comedians turn around and say, Judy, 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 I'm Cary Grant and I love you. Yeah, that sort of thing. It always sounds like you're kidding rather than doing anything serious. But Bill Evans, by contrast, is a serious influence. And therefore it's not surprising that he's also an educator and very much a philosopher, too. And yet, despite this strong influence he has, particularly on a young generation of musicians, I think the last thing that Bill would wish to do is to create a group of young pianists who play in his style. He argues, in fact, that style, for better or for worse, eventually comes of itself, out of that mysterious interior well of creative inspiration, which I guess nourishes everybody to one degree or another. It's much more important, Evans feels, to master fundamentals, both in theory, so that you understand what you're doing, and then in active practice, developing one's musical muscles, not just technical facility, but the brain connection with the arm muscle, so to speak. Developing that facility to the point where the subconscious mind can take over the basic mechanical task of playing thus freeing the conscious to concentrate on the spontaneous creative element that distinguishes the best jazz and I guess the best and perhaps all human activity. Now, if that sounds like nonsense to you, if you're a non-musician, let's say, you'll be familiar with this separation of jurisdictions from such common experiences as driving your car. You remember when you learn to drive, you first consciously learn the separate movements, turning the key and pulling, you know, whatever you did. And then you gradually relegated all of that movement and all of that individually willed movement to the subconscious, which then took over the machine and which should be made to pay the traffic tickets, I think, if we had things running right. But anyway, your subconscious eventually drives around town while your conscious mind engages in conversation or listens to the radio or that sort of thing. Now, so often we know nothing of an artist in various fields except what he produces. Well, the film now will introduce you to Bill Evans, the man, as well as Bill, the piano player. So here he is chatting with his brother Harry Evans, who himself is a music teacher in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I think that jazz very seldom in its true state is presented to the average public. They do have an idea of jazz which is not quite true. But the way I feel about it is that it is the only form of art that, in a way, America has created and given to the world in this century or in the past few centuries, let's say. But I think it's more of a revival in a different form of what went on in classical music before. In other words, in the 17th century, there was a great deal of improvisation in classical music, as you know. Right. And because of the fact that there were no electrical recording techniques or any way to permanize or to catch music and to record it, the music was written so that it could be permanized that way. And so slowly but surely, the writing of the music and the interpreters of the written music gave way to more and more interpretation and more cerebral composition and less improvisation, until finally improvisation became a lost art in classical music, and we have only the composer and the interpreter. So the composer even very seldom improvised, or didn't have to, say around the late 1800s or the turn of the century. But jazz, in a way, has resurrected that process, which I call the jazz process. Now, jazz, as we tend to look at it, is a style, but I feel that jazz is not so much a style as a process of making music. It's the process of making music, making 1 minute's music in 1 minute's time, whereas when you compose, you can make 1 minute's music and take 3 months to compose 1 minute's music. Now, that's the only basic difference. Now, it so happens that because of historical circumstances and where jazz was born or whatever came up to Mississippi and American music and the American culture and all, we think of jazz as a stylistic medium now, which in a way it is. But I think we must remember that in an absolute sense, jazz is more of a certain creative process of spontaneity than a style. Therefore, you might say that Chopin or Bach or Mozart or whoever improvised music, that is, was able to make music of the moment, was in a sense playing jazz. And we leave style out of it, and that's the way I feel about it in an absolute sense. I would like to say that one of the most thrilling things about jazz as a spontaneous creative process is, for instance, in recording it and later hearing oneself and being so surprised and at what has happened. And it might be interesting to note that any good teacher of composition, that is like serious classical music sort of composition, will always tell the student that the composition should sound as if it's improvised. It should have the spontaneous quality. So actually, the art of music is the art of speaking with this spontaneous quality. And that is the thrilling part of jazz, in that it has more or less resurrected the art of spontaneous creative music. Again, it hasn't been heard from since, what, the 17th century or the 18th century in classical music.
Well, as a teacher And as a jazz musician, sort of a Jekyll and Hyde existence, by day educator, by night jazz musician, it seems like no one is really that interested in finding out what is existing in jazz. Students that I've been teaching seem to have vast misconceptions about the creative element in jazz, as opposed to, say, classical music, you know. And the way of explaining it to me is you cannot go back and erase in jazz. In classical music, as you so often have said, it takes 3 months maybe to make one moment of music, and in jazz, one moment of music is one moment of music. Yeah. And it's this type of challenge that you have to direct yourself for that moment, and you have to call on all your energies and your intellect and physical energies and aesthetic energies and aesthetic sensitivity to your environment, and pour it all into this one moment, and you don't have time to even reflect on it, you know. Afterwards you may reflect on it, certainly, but at the moment you're inside of it. I remember hearing you play, and we were both playing at the same time when we were boys, where you could become involved and explore the subject. You kept exploring and exploring, and all I kept hearing was the excitement, or wanting the success, shall we say, preceding the years of involvement, of exploring and all this. And I think this again is true of so many people, and regardless of what field, again, the young business executive, the young man going into medicine or law, whatever it might be, where all they see is the end result, rather than seeing the intrinsic value of that field and what it can offer them as he becomes more and more involved in that particular subject.
I know exactly what you mean. I think the problem is that a person, I see this in a lot of people that come to me, for instance, for advice, or should they go ahead and so on, that they tend to approximate the product, rather than attacking it in a realistic, true way at any elementary level, regardless of how elementary, but it must be entirely true and entirely real and entirely accurate. They would rather approximate the entire problem than to take a small part of it and be real and true about it. And I think this is a very important thing, that you must be satisfied to be very clear and very real and to be very analytical at any level. You can't take the whole thing, and to approximate the whole thing in a vague way gives one a feeling that they've more or less touched the thing, but in this way you just lead yourself toward confusion. You know, and ultimately you're going to get so confused that you'll never find your way out. It is true of any subject that the person that succeeds in anything has the realistic viewpoint at the beginning, and knowing that the problem is large and that he has to take it a step at a time, and he has to enjoy the step-by-step learning procedure. Like, say we take a song. Maybe I'll use this song throughout as an example and treat it in different ways, but we all know this song, I Like New York in June, How About You? Well, say a person who wants to learn to improvise on this framework, and they've heard the top flight pianist handle this thing, so they hear them play it something like this, for instance, maybe. Well, they get an approximation of that, and rather than be satisfied with saying, I'll work simply with the framework and honestly and really, and say, play something simple like... They're going to try to approximate the other thing, but in a vague way, something like maybe... They're trying to do the thing in a way which is so general that they can't possibly build on that. If they build on that, they're building on top of confusion and vagueness, and they can't possibly progress.
I have to protect myself here.
Yeah.
Because you're hitting home.
Yeah.
This is my worst fault, is overplaying. But on the other hand, to thousands of musicians, such as myself, we have to overplay, I think, because we don't have time to even time to get to the keyboard to sustain the rudimentary thing.
But the thing is, the point is, what are you satisfied with? In other words, it's better to do something simple, which is real, and it doesn't have to be. It can still be satisfactory, but it's something you can build on because you know what you're doing. That's simple enough, but it's all within the absolute framework of what you're doing. Whereas if you try to approximate something which is very advanced and don't know what you're doing, then you can't build on it. That's the only point I'm making, really.
But again, I don't think you can just eliminate it, because we find a certain excitement about this. It's an enjoyment. It's a certain kind of enjoyment, and I wouldn't stop playing.
Oh, I think you could. Yeah, right. You could be too cautious. You could be cautious to the point where you never discover anything. I think you have to have a certain adventurous spirit. But let's say over a long period of time, you have to be aware of what is really accurate and what is not.
Right.
And when you're adventurous, you have to know when you succeed and when you don't succeed. That's all.
Right. Yeah.
Well, now, those of you who know not a great deal, let's say, about jazz, who grew up on classical music or folk music or rock and roll or popular dance music or whatever, you may possibly have some difficulty appreciating what a musician like Bill Evans is up to. You may even ask, and I think you should ask, why is what he does so much more truly art than what Trini Lopez or the Beach Boys or somebody do? Perhaps a comparison will help to make it clear. Take something you're familiar with, I'm sure, mathematics. There is this increasing sophistication from simple arithmetic, 1 and 1 is 2 sort of thing. You go up through first counting, and then addition and subtraction and multiplication and division, up through algebra, geometry, trigonometry, calculus, and so forth. That, I think, tells you something about Bill's music. It's just much more sophisticated. There's a great deal more to it. It's not simple rock and roll harmonics or folk harmonics by a long shot. And I think Bill will make this additionally clear to you as he moves toward the piano now.
Maybe we could demonstrate this. Could I use you as an instrument for teaching, maybe?
Love it.
This is a privilege as a teacher. I'm going to tell you exactly what to do, Bill. I hope you won't mind.
I'll try.
Because
Try to do it.
some of the term jazz is a nebulous term, and if we assume now that we do know nothing about jazz. Bill, would you play just a simple melody of Star Eyes? No harmonics. Nothing but the simple melody. Stop. Well, let's call that letter A, because that was 8 measures. We're going to repeat the same 8 measures, and we'll call this letter A again. Only this time, Bill, put the basic harmonies in this tune to that melody. We have 8 measures and 8 measures. A, A. And now we come to what the musician usually terms the bridge, or we'll call this letter B, which is a different section, 8 measures long. Now play letter B, Bill, or the bridge. D. And now we go back to the first 8 measures, and we call that A again. It's a repeat on the first 8 measures, so let's now play 8 measures more. Of course, Bill, right there, in this particular tune, even though you were playing it very simply by your terms, I know. Nevertheless, you had harmonies going, which were certainly harmonies in depth and complicated. Being a pianist, I know that harmonically there was something going on that was not as it was written, which immediately is an approach you use to harmonics. So we take just the first two measures, or the very first phrase of the tune, play just the melody, Bill, the first few notes. All right, just play that much again, and just put the very simple chord underneath it as it was written. Play it again, simply, just like that. Just. All right, I think here we get to jazz, because are we content to play this tune with this harmonic structure over and over again, maybe 100 times, maybe 1,000 times in our lives, and play it exactly like that? Now, Bill, play it again, only put your own harmonies underneath it. Yeah, there's a vast difference here between the harmonies that you're using and the harmonies that were originally written in a tune. Now let's get to the strongest creative element in jazz, which is improvisation. Now, even though the harmonies are beautiful, Bill, that you're using, and they're certainly beautiful, but nevertheless, these harmonies would even become, shall we say, static, or you wouldn't play it this way each time, 100 times or 1,000 times. The melody would be on top. So possibly, since you've deviated and created your own harmonics underneath the melody, now we can go ahead and create something on top of the melody itself, getting into the second element of music, melody. So now we could change the melody as we've changed the harmony. So how about improvising, taking the same first 8 measures, letter A, and improvise on that melody, and do us a favor, all of us, by returning to the melody every so often so we know where you are, or to identify the melody. I think here we've covered already the 3 elements of music: rhythm, harmony, and melody. And I think it's noteworthy to note that the jazz musician has changed every element. First of all, you changed the rhythm. You improvised on the melody. It was basically there all the time. But of course, you superimposed your own melody on top of it. And we've changed the harmonies. So possibly you could discuss it from your point of view, Bill.
Yeah.
From the artist's point of view. And
Well, let's go back to
you all right?
Let's go back to it.
Of course, jazz works within a framework, but nevertheless, it has afforded a great amount of freedom to the musician. Mozart, of course, loved to improvise because it was free, and Bach, and I feel this is a strong element in jazz. Is its freedom, this spontaneous creativity.
Well, I think for one thing, it's very important to remember that no matter how far I might diverge or find freedom in this format, that it only is free insofar as it has reference to the strictness of the original form. And that's what gives it its strength. In other words, there is no freedom without being in reference to something. Now, if you take this form in this strict form, and you find some way to get away from it, and that gives it a meaning. So,
in other words, you're saying before you can depart from something, there has to be something existing there.
There has to be something existing there, and if the person hears the way the player is playing, in other words, when I'm playing everything I play against the strict squareness of the original form, see.
Now, Bill's own development as an artist dramatizes the importance of knowing the rules. He began to play at the age of 6, and his early training was legitimate, classical, Sears Roebuck. He grew up in the town of Plainfield, New Jersey. Spent a lot of his early years there anyway. And as a youngster, he knew little or nothing of jazz influences until in his teens he began to play dance music using mostly, I guess, just the old stock arrangements. And only gradually, as he will tell you himself in a few minutes in this film, only gradually did he learn to add a personal contribution to what was written on paper.
And possibly, Bill, you could explain or trace your development somewhat to show how you got to this point. Because obviously when you're playing, you're using a tremendous facility, a tremendous ear for harmonics, and years of dedication and commitment to this.
You see, it's just like, say, it's obvious now that jazz is the most central and important thing in my life. Yet, I never knew that. I was involved with jazz, but, I went to college, I got a teacher's degree because I thought I might teach. But when the moment came, bang, I went out into jazz. It was like, it was so much a part of my inner life, and I didn't realize it. There was no, it's like you ask a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? Well, I would have said anything because I didn't really know, and I don't think many children do. But I just became so involved with jazz that that was a natural road, and it just pulled me here and pulled me there, and finally it revealed itself as the most important thing in my life. I started studying piano when I was 6, but this was classical music. Now, from the age of 6 to 13, I acquired the ability to sight read and to play classical music. So that actually, both of us, as you know, were performing Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, and so on, intelligently, musically. But yet I couldn't play My Country 'Tis of Thee without the notes. Now, this is the funny thing, to be able to play a masterpiece intelligently and musically, and still not to be able to be creative and understand music enough to be able to play a simple thing like My Country 'Tis of Thee without having the music in front of me. So when I first joined that rehearsal band that you were already with, remember Tony Martin? I read the stock arrangements exactly as written, chunk, 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 and once in a while they'd have a bell tone in the third chorus, ding, and I'd wait for that, because I had a little something. Well, one night I got real adventurous on Tuxedo Junction, and I put in a little, that wasn't written, and this was such an experience to make music that wasn't indicated, That really got me into starting to want to think about how to make the music. So, of course, I learned mostly on the job, and then I started to learn about changes and harmonics and how a tune was built harmonically, what so that I could remember the harmony and be able to play without music and be able to substitute one harmony for another or to change the harmonies and so on. Now, the whole process of learning the facility of being able to play jazz is to take these problems from the outer level in, one by one, and to stay with it at a very intense conscious concentration level until that process becomes secondary and subconscious. Now, when that becomes subconscious, then you can begin concentrating on that next problem, which will allow you to do a little bit more, you know, and so on and so on. And this is what happened, of course. But really, it wasn't until perhaps I started playing professionally when I was 13 and played at home and maybe 4 or 5 nights a week and as much as possible for all these years. And it wasn't until I'd say maybe I was 28 or something like that that I began to feel a degree of expressive ability, the ability to now let out my feelings freely through some sort of a craft, and this was in this simple area of the popular, you know, idiom.
But it is marvelous to see you get involved so quickly, you know. It doesn't take an hour of getting ready or preparing or getting in the mood or anything.
Yeah.
It could be 2 o'clock in the morning, it could be 8 o'clock in the morning, it could be at noon. Professional discipline.
Sure, you just learn to throw that switch in. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of times when you just feel like I can't possibly play, get up there and play, but as soon as you get up there and when the moment comes, you have that discipline. And there's a professional level of creativity that I can depend on and which is satisfactory for public performance always, and that I can depend on when I throw the switch. But those other high levels which happen just occasionally are really thrilling. You don't know when the heck they're going to come. I'm so happy with the trio I have now. We broke in and we worked about 5 weeks, and I knew that there was a potential here, and I didn't know what it was, and we finally got to San Francisco on our 6th week, I believe. And the 3rd and 4th night of the engagement, suddenly we just went into an area that was far and away above anything we'd touched. And it just proved everything to me about the potential of the group, and it was really a thrilling thing. But there's no way to try to do it. You can't try to recapture it. You know, all you can do is always look for it, and sometimes it happens. So that's how much really work it took for me. I don't consider myself as talented as many people. But in some ways that was an advantage because I didn't have a great facility immediately, so I had to be more analytical, and in a way this
forced you.
Yeah, it forced me to build something, you know, so that was good. But that might give you an idea of how the problem is approached and what degree of time and effort is necessary to make all of this subconscious so that you can then express yourself. And I would certainly say it's more than worth it, but I think most people just don't realize the immensity of the problem, and either because they can't conquer it immediately think that they haven't got the ability, or they're so impatient to conquer it that they never do see it through. But if you do understand the problem, I think then you can enjoy your whole trip through. I know I feel like I've been tremendously fortunate in finding the position that I now have.
Yeah.
And yet, I can remember coming to New York to make or break, you know, in jazz, and saying to myself, now how should I attack this practical problem of becoming a jazz musician as making a living and so on. And I said, well, ultimately I came to the conclusion that all I must do is take care of the music, even if I do it in a closet. See? And if I really do that, somebody's going to come and open the door of the closet and say, hey, we're looking for you, you know.
Yeah.
And this is the way I really approached the whole thing. I never tried really to push doors.
Most of us don't have this type of approach, you know. Our approach is, I have to do this and be accepted. So many of us are inclined to work and live for something else rather than the thing we're doing.
I had those things going too, but I mean, I always tried to discipline myself to you know, shut them out and all that. But really, I felt that otherwise, see, if I spread myself all over the place, I would have lost sight of everything. It's like you say, isn't it terrible that there's a war here and starvation there and poverty here? Now, what am I going to do as a human being about this whole thing, you know?
Yeah.
Well, gosh, if you try to accept every problem, you're just going to go insane.
Yeah.
So you have to choose some field in which you operate at your best capacity and which will then serve as an influence.
Yeah.
to deter all these other things that, you know, that you're worrying about. So I figure, like, if I take care of the music as best I can with my truest beliefs, then all these other things will be affected as I desire them to be affected, as much as I can affect them.
Can jazz be taught? Very good question, I guess. Well, on one level, you can teach appreciation, understanding, in the same way that you can teach people to appreciate or understand painting. And then, obviously, on another level, you can teach mechanics, technique, method, the process of jazz. I don't know if you can ever, you know, really get it into somebody's soul by just telling them about it, but maybe that's part of the process of their getting to feel it. In any event, here is Bill now explaining his theory of education.
When you begin to teach jazz, the most dangerous thing is that you tend to teach style. Now, I had 11 students. The one time I attempted to teach was at Lenox at the jazz school they had at Lenox at Music Inn in the Berkshires. And I had 11 piano students, and I would say 8 of them didn't even want to know about chords or anything. They didn't want to do anything that anybody had ever done because they didn't want to be imitators, you know. Well, of course, this is pretty naive and an attempt to circumvent great problems in music. But nevertheless, it does bring to light the fact that if you're going to try to teach jazz, you must try to teach principles which are separate from style. You must abstract the principles of music which have nothing to do with style, and this is exceedingly difficult. So their teaching of jazz is a very touchy point. It ends up where the jazz player ultimately, if he's going to be a serious jazz player, teaches himself. But the thing is that the jazz player, I think, ultimately must select and discard according to his own
Oh, I agree with you there.
Yeah,
I have one comment.
you know.
You'd be a tough student.
Believe me, I had them.
Most of us, certainly put myself in that category, is that we need someone to feed in procedures and approaches and tools and mechanics of doing things. Then we can depart, you know.
Well, I needed that too, Harry. And I mean, but the only thing is, you as an individual always make the decision of what you accept and what you reject. And I know you must have done the same thing. And I mean, that's the thing that you as an artist are really concerned with, is how are you handling your materials? Are you able to handle them in any way you want? And the mood is something else.
Oh, I think you're right. But I think we have to give them the materials.
Well,
You know, in other words, like, the first question always is, well, I can't stay on the F chord for 4 measures. What am I going to do? You see? All right, you can give them 4 avenues, 8 avenues, 12 avenues, you know, and say, well...
Or you can say find an avenue.
Or you can say find an avenue. But if you just say, well, find an avenue, you'd be fired as a teacher, you know? I mean, you just can't say find an avenue because we'll say, well, he's not teaching me anything.
Well, maybe that's the way to teach, though. Maybe if you say, well, you must find an avenue. The next week I'll show you an avenue, but this week find an avenue.
Oh, well, that way, yeah. You know, and the essence of teaching is to get the student excited about the subject and explore it on his own.
Right.
This is the essence of teaching.
Well, remember what went on between us in a way? In other words, because I felt that in order to motivate yourself further, you should discover things yourself. And it's the same way with a student. If you give him too much, you take his motivation away because he hasn't discovered anything.
Oh, true.
Right?
This is the knack of a good teacher. The pulse is to know when to feed in and when to draw back to a student. And I'll never forget that visit when you came down to my home in Louisiana, and I waited for you for 3 years. I hadn't seen you in 3 years, and told musicians in town, I said, well, Bill's coming down. Boy, am I going to learn this week. And you came down and spent a week with me, and I said, Bill, show me those changes, harmonics, you know? And this went on for 3 days, and you didn't move from the couch to show me. And about the 4th day, I said, Bill, will you please show me, you know? And you walked over to the piano and say, well, if you really want, I don't want to deprive you of the pleasure of finding this out for yourself, and for that reason, I'm not going to show you a thing. And if you sit at the keyboard and get into it yourself, it'll be a marvelous experience. But if I can show you in 2 minutes what I've done. And I think you're right, because 8 years ago when we were together, you did show me some changes when we were at Berkshire together. And you showed me some changes, and I'm using those changes today.
Right.
I still use
tricks
them. And they're tricks, And I think you're so right here that I can't get the joy out of playing this as I can something I've developed myself. It's certainly an area that the jazz musician is moving into, at least he's moving into now to the public eye, is in the area of composition, composing his own tunes. And of course there's a big area here, soundtracks for television shows and movies and so on. But I think here, Bill, the jazz musician is mostly concerned with building a framework for himself, too, he likes to develop his own tunes as vehicles to improvise.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you with your trio have been playing a lot of your tunes that you've composed. I know very much we'd all like to hear some of your tunes. Maybe you could just play the tune rather than improvise. You just play the framework, in other words,
Right.
in which you work using these tunes.
All right. Well, I suppose I do 2 or 3 of them, say, very early, which is kind of a waltz, pretty kind of waltz, and I'll do that and then go into a tune I call Time Remembered, which we use as a vehicle also with the trio. And from that I'll go into another theme that I call My Bells.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.